Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 311, Damming the Charles River. Hi, I'm Jake. This week, I'm going to be talking about the construction of the Charles River Dam in Boston. This monumental project transformed the tidal estuary of the Back Bay into a freshwater basin, providing a 20th century solution to problems that the city inherited from the 19th century, including issues with industrial waste, sanitation, and general public distaste for the acres of mudflats that were exposed at low tide. Temporary floodgates closed on October 20th, 1908, marking the first separation of the waters of Boston Harbor from the Back Bay's brackish salt marsh. In the lead up to this moment, earthen dams were constructed on both sides of the river, with a lock that allowed boats to pass through the dam on the Boston side, and a sluiceway to regulate the water level in the upstream basin on the Cambridge side. A temporary wooden dam was built to close the center of the river, allowing for the construction of a permanent dam made of dirt and stone. Despite facing challenges including turn-of-the-century NIMBYism, the dam was successfully completed by 1910. Its construction resulted in the creation of the Charles River Basin, the Esplanade, and some of Boston's most iconic sites for outdoor recreation. But before we talk about the dam that created our modern Charles River Basin, I just want to pause and say a big thank you to everyone who supports Hub History on Patreon. As you'll soon hear, this week's episode uses a lot of news coverage from the Boston Globe and the Boston Evening Transcripts. And newspaper databases are almost never free. Thanks to our generous sponsors, I can pay for research databases to be able to put together stories like this. But your support also pays for the basics. Podcast media hosting to deliver the audio RSS and MP3 files that enable you to hear the show. Web hosting for the companion website, so I can share pics, sources, and other notes along with each episode. And basic equipment like mics and headphones that I use to record the show. To everyone who's already supporting the show, thank you. If you're not yet a sponsor and you'd like to start, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. Now it's time for this week's main topic. The front page of the Boston Evening Transcript from October 20th, 1908 celebrated the moment when the temporary floodgates closed, for the first time separating the waters of Boston Harbor from the brackish tidal salt marsh of the Back Bay. For the first time in history, the Charles River flow was stopped. By the falling of a series of great shutoff gates, the timber dam that has been under construction for weeks near Craigie Bridge was completed at exactly 11 o'clock this forenoon. And from now on, the splendid river will be forced to confine itself to the locks and sluiceways, practically at man's behest, instead of flowing at its own sweet will from Watertown to the sea. In the months leading up to this point, an earthen dam had been built on both sides of the river, with a lock that let boats through the dam on the Boston side, and a sluiceway to regulate the water level in the upstream basin on the Cambridge side. Now a temporary wooden dam had been constructed to close the center of the river long enough to finish building the permanent dam out of dirt and stone. On that same day, the evening edition of the Boston Globe, which had taken an editorial position of steadfast support for the damming project, described the massive framework of timber and pilings that made up the temporary dam. Governor Guild, Mayor Hibbard, Mayor Wardwell of Cambridge, and a large gathering witnessed the damming of the Charles River this morning, preparatory to filling in the projected causeway between Boston and Cambridge. Joshua B. Holden, a member of the Charles River Basin Commission, at 11 a.m. threw the electric switch which released the 2,300 pounds of gate number 24 in the line of 82 frames, and it plunged down to the bed of the river. Immediately, 40 men with axes cut the ropes that held the remaining gates aloft, and they dropped, thus creating a solid dam across the river from the lock on the Boston side to the sluices on the Cambridge shore. The whistle on the temporary lock operating building was sounded, and men with axes climbed to the top of the wooden frames and stood ready to cut to the right and left and sever the ropes. Commissioner Holden, with the habitual long black cigar between his lips, stood at the Boston end of the huge framework that stretched across the river. There was another preparatory blast of the whistle, and then a toot that notified the men that the moment had arrived. Mr. Holden threw on the current, and a few seconds later, as the heavy gates dropped in groups, the whistles on the derricks, dredgers, and towboats were sounded, and the crowd cheered the accomplishment of the first spectacular demonstration of the progress of the engineering operations. Workmen with wedges locked the gate solidly, and before the observers left, there was being unloaded from the lighters the first filling to hold the dam steady. The Charles River is now closed to navigation excepting through the lock, and the basin above the Craigie Bridge location is now a body of water which may be maintained at any level the engineers wish. After wedging the gates at the top, workmen prepared to saw off the timber frame above the gates. The uprights should be cut off a few feet above the water so that the dredgers may distribute the filling on either side of the present dam to make the causeway. As anyone who's seen the Grand Canyon knows, the power of moving water is hard to overcome, so the idea of a simple wood frame holding back the might of the Charles left some observers with trepidation. Would the temporary dam hold up long enough to allow the work on the permanent dam to be completed? The coverage in the Boston Evening Transcript, which had been less supportive of the dam project up to that point, continues skeptically, "It may rebel before its bonds can be made permanent with steel and concrete. If it does, there may come a rending and rushing of timbers as the current plows through the temporary blockade that's now intended to hold the current until the main dam can be completed." But as soon as the gates were down, every man, dredger, or digging machine that could be concentrated at the spot made all haste to pile mud and gravel against the timber wall, that it might be reinforced rapidly enough to withstand the pressure that was sure to come against it later. Now, let's rewind a bit from this triumphant but risky moment. To understand why Bostonians wanted to dam the lower Charles River and Back Bay, imagine what it would have been like to stand on the shore at the foot of Boston Common in the early 19th century. Standing near today's Charles Street and looking west at low tide, you'd see miles of mudflats stretching out before you. Winding channels meandered through the marsh, and a spiderweb of hand-dug ditches connected them. Remnants of early attempts to drain as much water out of the bay as possible to make it possible to cut salt hay in the summer. Early in Boston's history, it was a place to dig clams and hunt ducks. And before the English colonized the Shawmut Peninsula, these winding channels hosted many fish weirs that provided an important food source to the Massachusetts people. If that all sounds idyllic, it probably was, as long as you don't mind the smell of a salt marsh. And given the cost of real estate in coastal places like Duxbury or Cohasset, plenty of people don't mind. The problem started with the Industrial Revolution, and it was compounded by Boston's growth over time. Before environmental regulations, the Charles River was heavily industrial. Just in the last few miles of the river, below the Moody Street Dam and the Waltham Watch Factory, the river hosted a paint factory, a bleach factory, a tannery, a massive federal arsenal, a munitions factory in Watertown, and an enormous slaughterhouse in Brighton. You can hear more about that slaughterhouse if you tune into episode 99 to learn more about Brighton's history as a cow town. All these factories, stockyards, and worse, discharged raw industrial waste directly into the Charles River. Upstream communities thought nothing about this because the river's current would carry away the most obvious evidence of contamination. However, the last few miles of the river were tidal, below the dam at Watertown Square and flanked by Watertown, Brighton, Cambridge, and Boston. At low tide, all the debris and contaminants from those upstream factories were deposited on the shores of the narrow channels in the Back Bay. Even worse was the sewage. Before sewage treatment plants were constructed at Columbia Point, then Moon Island, and now Deer Island, every home and business in Boston was connected to a sewer that simply ran to the nearest body of water and dumped raw sewage into it. The shores of the South Bay and the Back Bay were said to be particularly offensive, with a 19th century city council report concluding, "The Back Bay at this hour is nothing less than a great cesspool, into which is daily deposited all the filth of a large and constantly increasing population. Every west wind sends its pestilential exhalations across the entire city. A greenish scum many yards wide stretches along the shores, while the surface of the water beyond is seen bubbling like a cauldron with the noxious gases that are exploding from the corrupting mass below." Gross. Starting in 1821, a mile-long dam was built along the line of today's Beacon Street in an attempt to harness the power of the tides to drive mills that were clustered near today's Mass Ave. After that project failed, the dammed-up area was filled in starting in 1859. The new land was up to a mile wide in places, but that still left an easy half-mile of unfilled mudflats in the lower Charles River Basin. I could talk about the Back Bay landfill project all day, but I'll try not to get distracted. After that project failed, the dammed-up area was filled in starting in 1859. By the turn of the 20th century, Boston was eager to solve the problem of the remaining mudflats, and hopefully mask or eliminate the constant stench of raw sewage and industrial outflows. And the most straightforward solution to the problem was to cover the flats with water. Damming a navigable waterway required the Commonwealth's approval, so the legislature appointed a commission to study the problem. On March 27, 1901, the Harvard Crimson reported on a joint commission of the Massachusetts legislature, made up of the Committee on Metropolitan Affairs and the Committee on Harbors and Public Lands. This joint commission was meant to weigh arguments for and against damming the Charles River Basin. The first iteration of the plan they considered looked quite different from the basin we know today. It is not intended for the new plan to change the salt basin of the Back Bay into a freshwater pond. Instead of an old-style dam of rigid construction, the new plan suggests the erection of a folding or collapsible dam, similar to dams which have been successfully operated in the Ohio River and the River Thames in England. The folding dams constructed by the United States government in the Ohio are so arranged that by simple mechanism the whole structure can be laid flat below the level of the lower sill, so that ice can pass out and the water flow unimpeded, as if no dam existed. Thus, by emptying the basin and filling it again on the night tides, all the beauties of a lake can be obtained without changing to any appreciable extent the present degree of saltiness of the water in the Back Bay Basin. Proving that everything old is new again, the idea of a folding or retractable dam is quite current again in 2024. Cities from London to Venice have implemented retractable dams to protect the city against storm surges and sea level rise, while Boston has reportedly considered such a project to close the mouth of the harbor against rising tides. The Dutch are even considering 2 giant retractable dams to close off the entire North Sea before the rest of our polar ice melts. In 1901, however, the technology wasn't exactly up to that task, so a more conventional design was pursued. Even a normal, non-retractable dam had its critics, as reported in the Harvard Crimson again. As a side note, if you're wondering why we have so many quotes from the Crimson this week, it's because A, so many engineers from Harvard were involved in the planning that the dam project was a hot topic on campus, and B, the Crimson has an extensive free online archive that's easy to search. So anyway, on March 15, 1902, the Crimson reported, "The final hearing on the Charles River Dam was held yesterday morning. Dr. Henry J. Barnes, who appeared for the Tufts Medical School, said that if a permanent dam were constructed, the Fens Basin would become a stagnant pool, and that sewage would collect there in the absence of frequent flushings. Lewis S. Dabney, representing the Beacon Street residents, objected to the dam on the grounds that it would create a mill pond full of sewage, with a sluggish river flowing into one end of it. Notwithstanding these concerns, the legislature passed a bill creating a Charles River Basin Commission in 1903, charging them with the following. The commission shall construct across Charles River, between the cities of Boston and Cambridge, a dam, at least sufficiently high to hold back all tides, and to maintain in the basin above the dam a substantially permanent water level not less than 8 feet above Boston base. The dam shall occupy substantially the site of the present Craigie Bridge, which shall be removed by the commission. The dam shall not be less than 100 feet in width at said water level, and a part thereof shall be a highway, and the remainder shall be a highway or a park or parkway, as the commission shall determine. The dam shall be furnished with a lock, not less than 350 feet in length between the gates, 40 feet in width, and 13 feet in depth below Boston base, and it shall be built with a suitable drawbridge or drawbridges, wasteways, and other appliances. Because we'll hear this term a few more times, it's important to note that Boston City Base is a grade level that's used for planning and surveying throughout the city. It refers to a point 0.64 of a foot below the mean low tide level on Boston Harbor. The bill continues, the part of the dam used as a highway shall be maintained and operated in the same manner as the Cambridge Bridge, and under the laws now or hereafter in force relating to said bridge. The commission shall dredge navigable channels in the basin from the lock to the wharves between the dam and the Cambridge Bridge, to Broad Canal and to Leechmere Canal, the channel to be not less than 100 feet in width and 18 feet in depth. This new bill also enabled the new Basin Commission to address the complaints of Beacon Street abutters and Dr. Barnes of Tufts that the new basin would become just as choked with sewage as the existing tidal flats. The Commission, before the completion of the dam, shall construct marginal conduits on the north side of the basin from the outlet of the overflow channel on Binney Street to a point below the dam, and on the south side of the basin from the present outlet of the Back Bay Fens to a point below the dam. The conduits to be used to receive and conduct below the dam the overflow from sewers and the surface drainage and other refuse matter which would otherwise pass into the basin. To translate that a bit, margins are the edges, and a conduit is simply a sewer pipe. So a marginal conduit is a sewer running along the edges of the Back Bay neighborhood. All the existing sewer pipes that have been running directly into the Muddy River and the Fens, or straight into the Charles, would instead be intercepted by the new marginal conduit. This pipe would carry the raw sewage further into the harbor below the dam, where it would still run into the harbor without any treatment. Boston would have to continue loving its dirty water until the modern Deer Island treatment plant came online, finally, in the year 2000. By the end of September 1903, engineers working for the Basin Commission had started taking samples of the glacial soils underlying the chosen location for the dam to make sure it would support the wooden pilings that would be used during construction, with the Commission's first annual report noting, "These borings are being made by the ordinary wash drill method. An outside pipe called the casing pipe is driven into the ground. The material inside the pipe is washed up by a jet of water forced by a hand pump through a smaller interior pipe, known as the wash pipe, to the bottom of the boring, the action of the water being assisted by a chisel-pointed tool attached to the end of the wash pipe. Unwashed samples of the material through which the boring is made are taken about every 5 feet, or whenever the material changes, and are obtained by substituting for the cutting tool at the end of the wash pipe a short pipe with the lower end open, which is driven into the bottom of the boring, or, in case the material will not adhere to the side of the pipe, a valve is provided at the lower end to close when the pipe is lifted. These studies were crucial in developing the dam and basin, because there are hundreds of feet of soft glacial soil and muddy harbor sediments underlying the city and the Charles River. There was no chance to anchor construction footers to bedrock with the technologies of the day, so wood pilings were the next best solution. Throughout the Back Bay, the row houses, churches, our public library, and many other public institutions that were constructed in the late 19th century were built on top of spruce pilings. Essentially, you'd cut all the branches off of a 30 to 40 foot spruce tree, sharpen one end, and then drive it down into the ground. The friction of the surrounding soil held the pile in place, while retained groundwater created an anaerobic environment that prevented the wood from rotting. For a building like Trinity Church or the main branch of the BPL, hundreds of pilings were driven just a few feet apart. Then granite curbing was laid on top of them, and the walls were built on top of that. Because of the lateral force of the water that a temporary dam would have to withstand, oak was chosen as the material for the piles in the Charles. In the long run, granite and dirt would provide a solid foundation for the final dam, but they would also sit atop wood pilings, as described in the November 1907 edition of the Harvard Engineering Journal, as the project was nearing completion. Up to January 1st, 1907, 9,969 foundation piles have been driven in the Boston and Cambridge cofferdams, amounting to 297,000 linear feet. The average length of the piles under the lock after cutting off was 29 feet. Under the sluices, 31 feet 4 inches. The specifications called for piles to be winter cut from straight, live trees, with not less than 10 inches in diameter at the butt when cut off in the work, and not less than 6 inches in diameter at the small end. A safe load of 12 tons per pile was assumed for the lock foundations, and 7 tons per pile at the sluices. A retrospective on the project, published in the November 1908 issue of the Harvard Engineering Journal, notes that the temporary wooden dam was necessary due to the rapid flow of the tides in and out through the channel by Craigie's Bridge. As the tides changed, the current was too strong to allow earth dumped into the channel to stay there. Instead, the journal describes how the temporary dam was built to allow construction to continue. The body of the shutoff dam is composed of 6 rows of round piles, cross-braced, running across the river. 6-inch yellow pine sheeting was driven between the middle rows and cut off at elevation 97, grade 100 being mean low water in Boston Harbor. Earth was filled in on both sides, the sheeting, surrounded by riprap to elevation 97, placed so as to prevent scour. The driving of this piling was difficult because of the swift flow of the river, but it was accomplished successfully. There were 82 gates constructed, which ran in grooves built on heavy uprights. The gates were of 6 by 8 inch timber, braced lengthwise and diagonally, forming solid pieces, 10 feet wide by 15 feet high. Across the top of the uprights were placed timbers, the gates being held to these by ropes. At a given signal, these ropes were cut, and in 7 seconds, all of the gates were in place. We heard that part at the top of the show. Rubber hose was nailed on the bottom edge of each gate that the joint between the gates and the sheet piling might be as close as possible. As soon as the river was closed, the uprights projecting above the round pilings were cut off and removed, and rehandlers and dredges began at once to pile the earth against the shutoff. This filling is being continued so that the structure is really an earth dam with a wooden core wall. The dam, when finished, will consist of 2 concrete retaining walls faced with granite with an earth fill between. The downstream, or harbor wall, will extend straight across the river. The upstream, or basin wall, turns inward, so that the dam on the Cambridge end is not as wide as on the Boston end. A space has been left in it so that dredges, after filling in against the shutoff dam as much as possible, may pass out. By the end of 1904, the plans for the dam were fully fleshed out, and the November 29th edition of the Crimson reported the details of the contract that was being put out for bids. The The Charles River Basin Commission has advertised for bids on its contract for the dam, which is to turn the Charles River into a freshwater basin, unaffected by the tides. The dam will be built on the present site of the Craigie Bridge, and its total length will be 1,300 feet, the width varying from 140 to 490 feet. As a side note, the Craigie Bridge was originally built to carry boats from the Middlesex Canal over the Charles River. You can learn more about that in episode 225. The article continues, "It will consist of 2 masonry retaining walls on pole foundations, the space between them being filled with earth to a depth of from 15 to 50 feet. At the ends, the height of the dam will be 21 feet above mean low water, about the present level of the street at the Cambridge end of the Craigie Bridge. On the lower side of the dam, there will be a roadway 85 feet wide, and on the upper side, a park or embankment of 6 3/4 acres. There will also be an Esplanade constructed by the City of Boston, extending from Charles Bank Park to Charles Gate East, making a drive and walks in the rear of Bremer and Beacon Streets. On the Cambridge side, an embankment park for which the land has already been purchased will come nearly to the dam. The contracts call for the completion of the work by July 1908. The engineers of the commission have made the following calculations. Earth excavation, 340,000 cubic yards. Filling, 400,000 cubic yards. Concrete masonry, 41,000 cubic yards. Pilings, 490,000 linear feet. Pine lumber, 1.1 million feet. Spruce lumber, 550,000 feet. Riprap, 10,000 tons. There will be 2 locks in the dam, the larger being 350 feet in length and 45 feet wide, and of sufficient depth to allow a vessel drawing 16 feet of water to pass through at low tide. The smaller lock will be suitable for launches and rowboats. 8 sluices will be provided, and in emergencies, the smaller lock will be used as a flood sluice for letting water out of the basin. There will be also outlets for marginal conduits, through which all sewage outflow, which now goes into the basin in times of heavy rainstorms, will be carried down to the tidewater. The dam will maintain a basin 8 miles long and will affect the level of the water as far as the dam at Watertown. There will be 17.5 miles of shoreline, nearly all of which will be devoted to park purposes, the land having been purchased by the Metropolitan Parks Commission and the City of Cambridge. The level of the basin will be about 2 feet below the present mean high tide level. Within months, the contractors were hired and work had started. At the close of the first season of construction, the October 25, 1906 Crimson again reported on progress on the dam, locks, and on the crucial sewer conduit that would finally solve the smell problem in the Charles. Work on the Charles River Dam, which was begun March 1, 1905, has been continued without interruption during the summer. All the concrete work is practically finished, and the sluices and small boat lock on the Cambridge side will be completed before the cold weather. The Boston marginal conduit, through which all overflow from the sewers on stormy days will be carried down to the tidewater instead of into the basin, is as near completion as the rest of the work will permit. In the Broad and Leechmere canals and in the basin, about 90% of the piles to support the wharves and walls have been driven, and dredging in the basin just outside the entrance to the Broad Canal has been begun. A taking has recently been filed and work begun on the Boston Embankment, extending from the Cambridge Bridge along the Boston shore as far as the southerly side of the Back Bay Fens. Construction work on Section 1 of the embankment comprises 2,700 linear feet of retaining wall and about the same length of earth embankment. The Commission will soon receive bids for the work on Section 2, which is located back of Beacon Street. Along the wall south of the Cambridge Bridge, the Esplanade will vary in width from 180 to 300 feet, and the portion in the rear of Beacon Street will be 100 feet wide. It will be made of excavations from the basin, held in place by concrete masonry retaining walls faced with ashlar masonry on piles. The continuation of the Boston Marginal Conduit will be built in this fill. Along with the locks, sluiceway, and sewage pipe, the new dam was also designed to carry a broad roadway to replace the Craigie Bridge, which would allow streetcars to share lanes with teams of horses. However, Boston didn't yet have a unified transit system, so provisions also had to be made for the elevated railway. The January 17, 1908 Evening Transcript describes the work on the new transit bridge that was being built to parallel the Charles River Dam. Mild weather is helping to rush the work on the new elevated railway bridge that's to span the Charles River close to the downstream face of the new Charles River Dam. Already the piling and a large portion of the concrete foundation work for 4 of the new bridge piers, 2 on either side of the river, is far advanced. The bridge is to be made of concrete, stone, and steel, costing in the neighborhood of $550,000. And it will take about 3 years to build. There will be 13 piers of stone carrying 12 large spans, including a draw. 2 of the central spans will be 160 feet long, and the others will be 100 feet or a little more in length. According to the plans, the new bridge will be carried across the river at a height sufficient to allow any craft to pass under it, which can at present pass under the new West Boston or Cambridge Bridge, as it's now officially known. The draw in the new bridge will come just opposite to that at the lock in the dam. This bridge will tower above the dam, but the plans call for an ornamental structure which the company is satisfied will not materially detract from the general beauty of the basin. The purpose of this bridge is to carry fast surface cars of the large semi-convertible type from East Cambridge to the Boston subway, running upon the L tracks from Lechmere Square, East Cambridge, across the river on this new bridge and the proposed L in the west end, to the subway at the North Station. As was originally intended, the usual surface cars will go over the present route, crossing the river by means of the top of the new dam. Now that our transit system is unified under the MBTA, this elegant bridge, with its 12 ornamental arches, still carries the Green Line tracks from Science Park to Lechmere. By April 1908, the old Craigie Bridge was being disassembled to make way for the dam to take its place. Eventually, the main roadway would be relocated from the Craigie Bridge to the dam's surface, where we today drive past the Museum of Science. Luckily, a temporary replacement bridge was already on hand to carry the Craigie's traffic until the new road was completed. The second annual report of the Charles River Basin Commission said, "A fortunate solution to the problem was found when the officials of the Boston and Maine Railroad considered to allow the Commission to use the Boston and Lowell Freight Bridge, next below the Craigie Bridge, which, under Chapter 465 of the Acts of 1903, the railroad is ordered to remove. By the construction of short approaches to Bridge Street in Cambridge and Leverett Street in Boston, and some reconstruction of the railroad bridge, a better highway than the present Craigie Bridge can be secured for traffic." As the summer of 1908 came to a close, the construction of the dam was on track for completion by October 18th. That date was selected to take advantage of annual fluctuations in the tides. For a few days in late October, the tide in Boston Harbor falls to its lowest level of the year, about a foot lower than the lowest tide just a week later. That important deadline was called into question on October 12, 1908. When the Globe reported that the city of Cambridge was asking for a delay of 2 days to allow them to complete some waterfront projects before the waterfront rose to meet them. According to the article, the work includes the removal of several hundred feet of old seawall near the Brookline Street Bridge, the construction of a beach, also of a new seawall near Western Avenue. The contractor has been diligent in carrying forward the work, but at the present rate of progress, it cannot be completed by October 18th. Mayor Wardwell, acting on the advice of the Parks Commission, has asked for the necessary delay. The commissioners replied that a delay would not be possible, with the Globe continuing, "The principal danger, it is said, is in the lock. Since a portion of the river has been dammed, the water runs through the lock with the speed of a mill race. Several small boats have been overturned in trying to make the passage, and in 2 or 3 instances, persons have narrowly escaped drowning." This exact hazard had been warned about in the pages of the same paper just a few weeks before. On September 17th, the Globe reported, "Of late, there has been quite a number of accidents at the new lock on the Charles River Dam, in which people have had to be pulled from the water by those working about the dam or lock. Unless the people of the city begin to realize the changed conditions in the river at that point, owing to the construction of the dam, there is bound to be more or less trouble in the future among the users of light riverboats and canoes. One motor canoe now lies at the bottom of the river near the dam entrance, and its occupants were rescued with some difficulty. Several larger boats have been swamped, and a large number of others have been in grave danger there because of the fearful currents which swirl through the lock, except at certain stages of the tide. Between the lock and the Boston side of the river has been filled in, and there is only a comparatively small and ever-decreasing opening on the other or Cambridge side of this lock. The entire channel current passes through the lock, and for an hour after or before flood or ebb tide, the current is strongest, and rushes swirling through the lock entrances with fearful power. Pleasure boat people rarely seem to realize its terrible strength and are caught in the current, and their craft thrown against the lock entrance and nearly or quite swamped before they realize what's happening. A half-dozen or more boys have been fished out of the river there of late, and as a large number of them play in the boats near that point, there is a constant danger that they will sooner or later meet with a serious accident. Despite the danger to boaters, the Commission agreed to a brief delay for Cambridge. But days later, a sand and gravel company that leased tidal flats near the dam sued to delay the closing to October 27th or beyond. The delay was meant to allow their case to go forward, and might have led to a permanent injunction. But the SJC ruled that the Commonwealth's right to all intertidal lands superseded the gravel company. As you heard at the top of the episode, the giant wooden floodgates of the temporary dam came crashing shut on October 20th. 2 days behind the target date, but still soon enough to take advantage of the lower tides. The work was far from over, however, with the next day's Harvard Crimson reporting, "The flow of the Charles River was stopped yesterday by the closing of the dam that's been under construction for several months near the Craigie Bridge. The cutting off of the river channel is to allow the construction of the main section of the permanent dam and roadway. It will be fully a year from now before the completion of the entire work can be observed, for after the dam is finished, a roadway 100 feet wide is to be built along its top, serving as a permanent substitute for the old Craigie Bridge. The shutting off of the water will benefit rowing conditions, since the high water will increase the number of long stretches, and there will be no apparent current." In that year of construction that would follow, a roadway would be built on top of the dam to replace the Craigie Bridge, and to replace the railroad bridge that was serving as a temporary alternative. Before construction had kicked off, there was a healthy debate about how this roadway should be constructed, as designers had to balance a lower roadway that would require the drawbridge to open more often to let large boats through, with a higher roadway that would require smaller loads of freight and wagons and carts to spare the teams of horses that had to haul them up to the bridge. With a higher roadway that would require smaller loads of freight and wagons and carts to spare the teams of horses that had to haul them up to the dam. The second annual report of the Charles River Basin Commission explains how they settled on a design that put the roadway, and thus the final earthen dam, at 21 feet above Boston City base. Studies were made of the relative advantages and disadvantages of a high and low-grade dam. Considerable attention was given to records of past and present traffic through the draw of the Craigie Bridge, showing the number of vessels that would and would not require the opening of the draw in a high-grade dam, and to records of traffic over Craigie, Warren, and Charlestown bridges to determine the effect of a high-grade bridge upon teaming. It was decided that the dam should be at a grade satisfactory for heavy teaming, with approaches that would not make it necessary to reduce the size of loads which could be transported on the practically level streets in that vicinity, and that the amount of time lost by openings of the draw for tugs and mastless vessels could be more than compensated for by increasing the width of the highway over that at present existing, particularly at the drawbridge. If the point of building the dam was to flood the tidal mudflats along the banks of the Charles to keep the smell down, the project was not immediately successful. The floodgates of the temporary dam were closed on October 20th, but on October 23, 1908, the Globe reported, "The Charles River Dam, which was closed Tuesday forenoon to keep out the tidewater and make the new Charles River Basin a body of fresh water, is to be opened within a day or two to admit the salt water again for a while, because of the slowness with which fresh water has come down the river to fill the basin since the closing of the gates. The prevailing drought is the cause of the failure of the basin to fill up to the desired height. Yesterday, 48 hours after the gates were closed, the water was still 3 feet lower than it ought to have been, and the river above the Cottage Farm Bridge, which we know as the BU Bridge today, was so low that it was more or less unsightly, and in places showed so much mud as to cause uneasiness to people living in the vicinity. When enough rain has fallen to warrant it, the salt water will be drained off, and the basin allowed to fill up with fresh water till the depth of the water in the river is 2.5 feet less than it used to be at mean high water. In the future, it's proposed to keep the river at that reduced level." On the day the dam closed, the Boston Evening Transcript reported on how a slowly rising water level in the Charles River Basin would limit access above the upstream bridges that weren't drawbridges, as well as broader changes to the local landscape. Only mastless vessels may pass through the Big Lock for points above Cambridge Bridge, the next one upstream, but all sorts of sailing craft or barges may pass through for points along the Broad and Lechmere canals, leading inland to East Cambridge industrial plants and lumber yards from this lower section of the new basin. The entrances to these canals have been rebuilt since the river improvement started, and both canals have been deepened by dredging. The entrance of Broad Canal, close to the Cambridge end of the Cambridge Bridge, is of stone and masonry, harmonizing with the new bridge itself and providing a terrace on which frequenters of the parkway may linger out of the way of the boatmen to watch vessels make their way in or out. The entrance of Lechmere Canal, down near the sluiceways for the dam, is crossed by a new roll-lift steel bridge that will connect the new Commercial Avenue with Bridge Street, and also serve to some extent for access from the dam to the riverbank system of parkways along the Cambridge side. A new playground and water park is now being slowly developed on the dump, just above the Lechmere Canal entrance between Commercial Avenue and the main river. This will be a fair balance for the Charles Bank Park and Gymnasium on the Boston side opposite. The upstream face of the dam will be a handsome park. The playgrounds and so-called gymnasiums along the Charles Bank were some of the first playgrounds in the United States. You can hear more about how the women of Boston invented playgrounds in episode 111. Now, I think our listeners are probably familiar with locks, but you can listen to episode 225 about the Middlesex Canal for more detail. On a surface level, a canal lock is an enclosure with gates at either end that a boat can enter while the water level inside is raised or lowered to meet the level of the water outside. The Charles River Lock would raise a boat from the tidal harbor below the dam to the retained basin above the dam. The January 1907 Harvard Engineering Journal describes the lock as it neared completion. The lock as constructed consists of a massive reinforced concrete structure with expansion joints placed on piles and includes the foundations for a Schertzer rolling lift bridge at the roadway, recesses into which the great steel lock gates are drawn when the lock is opened, bollards, and electrically operated capstans to aid vessels passing through the lock. Over the recesses, houses are to be built of masonry to include living rooms for the superintendent and men, a boiler room, pumps to empty the lock when necessary, workrooms, offices, and an operating tower where an attendant, by means of a switchboard, may control the drawbridge, lock gates, and lock filling gates. Shortly after the lock system was completely operational, the Cambridge Tribune published a report on how it worked on April 9, 1910. This is kind of a long excerpt, but I appreciate the detailed description of the facilities and the operations of the lock, so try to bear with me. For the operation of these parts of the dam, considerable complicated machinery is necessary, all of which is housed in or controlled from the lower lock gatehouse. 30 men are employed. The most interesting work is done in a room at the top of the tower, surrounded by big bay windows, from which there's a clear view of all parts of the system. This is the eye of the dam. 3 operators or electrical assistants, each working an 8-hour shift, cover the 24 hours of day and night. Their tasks are various and multitudinous. Surrounded on all sides by a bewildering array of delicate electrical machinery, an operator sits at his desk. Close at hand are 2 telephones, one for the house, the other for outside communication. In front of him are several kinds of weather apparatus, augmented by daily forecasts, etc., for an important part of his duty is to watch for sudden changes in the weather. A quick thaw or a strong westerly wind warns him that the water will pile up in the big basin, and he must be ready to tap and draw off the surplus through the sluiceways. Toots from the whistle of a grimy little towboat coming up through the railroad bridges with a tow tell the operator that she wants to come through. He answers with his compressed air whistle, which also notifies the men who handle the gates of the draws. The work of the ordinary drawbridge is doubled, as the 2 leaves of the bridge and the lock have to be operated at the same time. If the lock happens to be at the level of the basin, the upper gate has to be closed and the gates in the lower lock gate open to reduce the level of the lock to that of the outside lower level. All this is going on while the leaves of the drawbridge are opening, so there is no loss of time for the industrious little towboat in its charge. The most modern machinery for the quick handling of the draws and lock are in service, with the result that street traffic and river traffic are never delayed more than 3 or 4 minutes. Everything is electrically operated and controlled, the current being furnished by both the Edison Company and the Boston Elevated Railroad Company. The operator throws in the necessary switches and walks over to work as controller, which is very similar to that used by the motorman of a streetcar, which is so placed near one of the windows that he can see what's happening outside. Things invisible to him, such as the filling gates and the lock gates, are kept track of through the medium of telltale incandescent globes, which show by their glow whether the gates are all right. There are sets of these globes for each set of gates, so located near the operator's desk that he can readily see them at the time of working. In addition are gauges, which indicate the height of the tide. A very necessary adjunct, as it sometimes happens that the saltwater outside is higher than the basin, and the gates and sluiceways must be controlled accordingly. The interiors of the gates are fitted with steam radiators to prevent freezing of the working parts, and have compressed air lubricating devices. Inside also are air compartments and a system of airlocks, which permit men to enter them and to make repairs, even while the gates are in use. In the lower gate are 6 filling gates, and in the upper gate 7 filling gates and an ice gate, which is approximately on a level with the basin, and through which the broken ice is allowed to pass, a tug being employed to break up the ice and keep the channel open. All the filling gates and the ice gate are operated from the tower. In addition to the big lock, which is 366 feet long and 45 feet wide, there is a small lock at the Cambridge end of the dam for power and small boats, which is 55 feet long and 10 feet wide. Though the locks in the old Charles River Dam are no longer functional, you can still see the gatehouse with its tower and copper-wrapped bay windows on the dam next to the channel of the old locks. It was appropriate that the building was eventually reused as an MDC police station, because once the dam was complete, public attention shifted to making use of the new public land that was created by damming the Charles and filling in along the banks on the Boston side. Because Harvard is Harvard, a lot of the coverage in the Crimson focuses on the benefit to college rowing teams. The Globe highlighted the parkland that would be created along the new Charles Bank. And the December 9th, 1908 Evening Transcript reported on one congressman's plan to moor the USS Constitution in the newly constructed freshwater basin. One great obstacle lies in the way of that solution to the problem as to the final resting place of the old war vessel. It is the task of squeezing a ship that is 45 feet in width through 7 drawbridges that are considerably less than 45 feet wide, 2 of them measuring only 36 feet across. Then, too, it is doubtful whether the ship could be forced through the Charles River Dam lock itself, after it had been worked up through the drawbridges, for that concrete structure is just 45 feet in width. If the old ship is swelled with age, if there happens to be any protuberances on her sides due to replaced plankings, even to the extent of an inch, she could not be pulled through. This wasn't an entirely unfounded fear. While I was researching this episode, I stumbled across an article from October of 1907 about a schooner that got stuck in the old Craigie drawbridge. It took almost 3 hours and a chain hooked to a locomotive to drag the ship out. Besides improved rowing conditions for the Harvard crew team and the failed dream of towing old Ironsides into the basin, the December 2nd, 1909 Springfield Republican reported on preparations for another recreational use of the city's new public waterway. The State Fish and Game Commissioners last week stocked the Charles River Basin with 11,000 fingerling trout and 3,000 white perch fry to complete its transformation from tidewater to a freshwater lake. The commissioners will recommend to the next legislature that the basin be closed to fishing for a term of 3 years, at the end of which they believe anglers will find excellent sport within the Boston city limits. Within a few weeks of the article about stocking fish above the dam, the Charles River Basin project was effectively complete. On January 26, 1910, the Boston Globe reported on the first streetcar to cross the new dam. The first electric car to cross the Charles River Dam passed over that structure at 1 yesterday afternoon, while crowds shouted, whistles tooted, and those who have taken part in the great work viewed the scene with delight and satisfaction. The new roadway on top of the dam finally opened to horse teams and pedestrians on January 27, 1910. Other than some final landscaping, this was the last work to be completed on the project, allowing the newly filled soil on the dam to settle before paving the new road. In the end, the entire project came at a cost to the taxpayer of $3.99 million, in 1910 dollars, that is. I've come to kind of hate trying to convert historical currency to modern dollars, but that figure equates to something like $130 or $140 million today. In exchange for not quite $4 million, the Charles River Basin Commission's final report describes what the Commonwealth got. The Commission is able to report that it has added nearly 35 acres of made land to the park area, established a constant water level in the basin having an area of 800 acres, and covered up 175 acres of mudflats which were formerly exposed at low tide. A tidal estuary, which was not exactly clean, has been transformed into a freshwater basin, thus securing permanent improvement of nearly 18 miles of shore dedicated almost entirely to public uses. According to a 1910 article written by the chair of the Metropolitan Parks Commission, the new dam was meant to be handed over to the MPC, and thence to the Metropolitan District Commission, predecessor to the DCR, starting in 1911. An MDC report titled, "Welcome to the Charles River Dam," describes how well the Charles River Dam worked in meeting its original goals, as well as why it was superseded by a new dam a few decades later. The new river basin was set at 8 feet above low tides, allowing about 6 to 8 hours at each tide for sluicing river discharge by gravity flow. Design of sluicing facilities was based on 10% in excess of flood flow records for a freshet of February 1886, the largest recorded flood up to that time. The sluicing waterway area served adequately in controlling maximum basin levels in a range of elevation 109 to 110.2, until 1954, when Hurricane Carol, accompanied by heavy rain, flooded Storrow Drive because of its low elevation of 109.5. A year later, Hurricane Diane hit the Boston area with a 12-inch rainfall, and the basin level reached 112.55. Basin flooding caused damage of nearly $6 million and estimated $24 million at today's costs. Lack of pumping was the big problem, for floodwaters could not be released from the basin into the harbor when tides reached the basin level. Following extended controversy over the best remedy, construction of a new $58.7 million dam was started in 1974 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in conjunction with the Metropolitan District Commission. It was completed in late 1979. The new Charles River Dam is a multi-purpose dam using locks and sluiceways to control the elevation of the Charles River Basin. The locks serve dual purposes. They pass boats between Boston Harbor and the Charles River Basin, and they drain excess floodwaters from the basin into the harbor during flood conditions, which occur when the basin level reaches 2 inches above the 108 constant maintained by the Metropolitan District Commission. The pumps at the new Charles River Dam have the pumping capacity to convey water at a rapid rate back into the harbor through discharge pipes or sluices. Today, the Boston embankment that made up much of the 35 acres of newly made land is the Esplanade, and it provides some of the most iconic Boston views for visitors and recreation space for residents, as well as hosting the fireworks and Boston Pops concert each Independence Day. The Museum of Science now occupies most of the dam itself. You can rent kayaks and paddleboards near Herder Park in Alston or Kendall Square in Cambridge. Or you can take sailing lessons at community boating just steps from the Charles MGH T-stop. 8 miles of perfectly flat water lead upstream to Watertown Square, with college and public boathouses along the banks, and a network of multi-use paths leading all the way to Waltham. I'd say we got our $4 million worth. To learn more about the Charles River Dam and Basin, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/311. I'll have lots of sources for you to browse this week, including the Charles River Basin Commission's annual reports for 1903 to 1910, which include pictures and way more details of the project's design and execution than I could pack into this episode. I'll also link to a few articles about the project from the 1907 and 1908 Harvard Engineering Journal, as well as a 1910 article by the chairman of the Metropolitan Parks Commission outlining the state of MPC parks as the Basin project concluded. I'll give you links to news coverage from the Boston Globe and Evening Transcript and from the Springfield Republican. Plus, we'll have some good public domain photos of the project, especially the ceremonial closing of the temporary dam on October 20th, 1908. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and most active on Twitter. If you're on Mastodon, you can find me as @hubhistory@better.boston. Or just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop us a line, and we'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners. Here's a fun fact. Right after I finished editing this episode, I learned that the old lock gatehouse that I described kind of late in the episode, the stone building with a control tower and copper-wrapped bay windows in the control tower for the operator to keep an eye on things from, is actually a 2024 Preservation Achievement Award winner from the Boston Preservation Alliance. That's the same award that Hub History won in 2020. The building will still be used by the Mass State Police, but after a multi-year renovation that preserved as many original elements and materials as possible while also implementing environmentally friendly technologies, it's now LEED Gold certified. Pretty cool.